Hello all, welcome to Gelvin Valley, this masterpiece of a farming simulator map created by Wild Wild Wes for Farming Simulator 15. We'll continue our efforts here, picking up some of the grass along the edges of the fields that we recently purchased and that we'll soon be plowing out. And we'll continue also, I wanted to continue visiting about something none of you can see on this map. I've just kind of been on a local history kick here of late, thinking about these railroads that are close to our home. And, you know, if the rest of the world has had something similar happen, and maybe it isn't, maybe it's just the area of the U.S. that I live in, but I don't think it's totally uncommon. You know, if you look at a history of rails in the country, they peaked, at least in terms of miles of track, many years ago. And I don't have the data in front of me to be able to say, you know, just when that peak happened. All I know is that each passing year, there is less and less rail that is actually used, at least here in the U.S. And, I mean, some of that is said with some irony because there is new rail being put in. I know here locally, well, not here locally, it's more to the north, a town, the largest city in Oregon, here where I live, Portland, you know, where they put in some light rail, which is primarily for, well, when I was up there, I was going to say it's primarily for just people wanting to, you know, commute or whatever. There was a lot of unsavory folks that rode on that thing, but I won't get into all that here. The point is they are putting in new rail. It just isn't the traditional railroad that is been put in. So, you know, last episode we kind of talked about something locally called the Geer branch. Geer spelled G-E-E-R. I think that was a former governor of Oregon or something way back in the day. And it's just a short section of rail. Oh, I would guess probably no more than 10 miles total. You know, half of it in the country, half of it in town. Shoot, maybe it's even shorter than that. Maybe there's something here I'll be reading in a moment that would say how far it was. But the most of the line, I mean, it's what would be considered an abandoned railroad. Most of the rail has been picked up. It's just simply gone. You can still see the right-of-way as to where it went. It's pretty amazing looking at Google Maps. You can still see it and follow pretty much the exact route. And, you know, it's just a matter of time. I say that today, but I can envision a time in the future, 10 years go by, 20 years, and pretty soon all remnants of it are gone. And it's just, you know, you wonder, will anybody ever remember? One day I'll be the old timer that says, yeah, I remember trains there, and okay, Grandpa. So I know that this, you know, this is my local area. I'm sure in your local area there's something similar, maybe not even having to do with trains or railroads. And, you know, as I share this here, I'm looking at an old map. What is the date on this? In 1925. It's a map of the area. I see Geer on here plainly. I can see exactly where the route went into town. Well, at least till the map cuts off. It isn't the nice seamless maps, you know, that we have available now. But in pretty good detail, you can see exactly, you know, where it went, and you also see lots of other things, you know, just speaking of history. I never knew, for example, that there were so many schools back in the day. You know, I'm seeing schools I've never heard of sprinkled throughout all the country, you know, where I roamed as a boy. They're long gone now, and I wonder if it's because there just isn't that many people out in the country anymore, where previously there may have been a lot more farms. Now it's concentrated in fewer hands, so there's less people, so they don't need the schools. I look at the roads and I recognize roads that are still there today. They've changed their shape a little bit. They're straighter now. There's fewer curves. And so those kinds of changes come in over the time. The one thing that doesn't change, of course, is the basic topography, where the rivers are and all those things, the way God made them and put them in there. But obviously everything else around it, has changed. But like I say, I was kind of on a history kick. I do really, really enjoy trains and locomotives and those kinds of things. So I've always been interested in studying that kind of thing, especially getting it out of school and no longer having to take tests on it. So last time, like I say, I visited a little bit out Geer, this Geer branch, and some memories that I have, and talked through the route, if you will. Kind of had Google Maps up. I still got Google Maps up, so I can look at where it used to be. But now it's just kind of sadly in the imagination, if you will. You kind of got to fill in some gaps, and more on that in a little bit. But something I wanted to do with this Geer branch is, see what I could find on the good old World Wide Web. So this, I'm reading here now from something that is on a website called trainorders.com. And, this is what is freely available. This site has some pictures on it, and I would love to see more detail on these pictures, because it's historical pictures kind of in the area, where I live. And oftentimes when we think of historic pictures, we think of black and white, something very, very old, at least 100, 200 years old. Well, they didn't have pictures back then, but you know what I'm saying. But history anymore, as more time goes by, every moment in the past, of course, is history already. So some of these were even in color, but this particular site, their text and everything you can freely read. But if you want to zoom in on any of the pictures and look at them up close, like we, like to do, you got to pay something. So you have to really like trains, if you want to participate in this particular site. So, but I think the people that frequent it are not just train enthusiasts, but they're people who have worked, in railroading in the past or that kind of thing. So, and this was posted, it's in a section called Nostalgia and History. It's kind of an online forum, if you will, where people can put comments in. And the thread is called Destruction and Dismantling on the Southern Pacific Geer Branch. So someone here back in February of 2019 wrote, Southern Pacific's Geer Branch ran from Salem near the Southern Pacific Passenger Station 6.5 miles to Geer on the Woodburn Springfield, later Staten Branch. Okay, so I was wrong. Earlier I said maybe it was 10 miles. Well, turns out it's 6.5. So, okay, I guess I'm off. I bet it's 10 by road. But yeah, the railroad obviously is much straighter. And the name that they have, by the way, the Woodburn Springfield or Staten, it no longer has that name. I think it was the Willamette Valley Railway is what it was called. But formerly was Southern Pacific. Anyway, continuing reading, there were a couple industries between I-5 and Lancaster Road, but not much anywhere else on that line. In the time I was growing up in Salem, the line east of Lancaster Road to just about Geer was unused as far as I knew. In the late 60s and early 70s, photos were taken in 1971, Southern Pacific used the branch to dismantle 40-foot boxcars. The only thing I didn't know, not was I curious or smart enough to figure out whether those cars were delivered from the Woodburn Springfield branch or from Salem Yard. It says these photos are just about the only time I saw anything on that portion of the line at that time, and I can't even tell exactly where this was. Years later, I chased a local out of Salem to Woodburn and then to West Staten, but gave up before they made the return to Salem via the Geer branch. Not long after that, the Root brothers took over the West Staten branch and the Y at Geer, plus some of the Geer branch, and at one point used the Geer branch to store cars. But that's a story for another time. Okay, so some of this, is corroborated. I mentioned last time, that it was used to store cars for a period of time. That kind of corroborates what I shared last time. But I think the gentleman is mistaken, where he says that it was used to dismantle 40-foot boxcars. That part I don't remember. And of course, he has earlier pictures. He's talking 60s and 70s. Well, that's back when the branch would have actually been used. I have literally, with my own eyes, seen trains on this branch, locomotives pulling cars. So I know it was used, and I was born in 74, so it was used, into the 80s at least. So I'm not sure what this person's talking about. And when I say use it, they went clear into Salem, all the way to, the junction, I think, in town. Anyway, it continues. Someone else writes in here, boy, those photos bring back a few memories. Kind of depressing to see it in that condition, though. During my teen years in the mid to late 50s, a neighbor, Joe Hissel, held down the conductor's job on the Salem, Woodburn, Staten, Salem run that you mentioned in your post. Joe was very sociable and had a great tolerance for young boys who loved trains, so I was able to join him on many of his runs over this route, either riding in the caboose or on the lead locomotive. The first diesels that went to work on that run were the little 5100 series GE 70-ton units, which looked like switch engines but were classified by Southern Pacific as a DF, that is a diesel freight unit, something I could never get used to. To my young mind, after seeing the new EMD SD9 showing up in SP's Willamette Valley service, the 5100 seemed too mousy looking to be a road unit. As luck would have it, toward the end of the 50s and into the 60s and beyond, a single SD9 became the primary power for that run. The Geer branch was never much to look at, and I can't recall ever seeing a train running on it, aside from the ones that I rode on. It seemed sort of like someone's back alley as it passed straight as an arrow through a lot of residential and small farm properties to connect up with SP's East Side line. My grandfather, George Alexander, was warden of the Oregon State Penitentiary at that time, and the Geer branch tracks went along the south side of the prison property, not far from the warden's mansion that we frequently visited as children. Yeah, it's interesting, this person here, they left their name. They're writing from Phoenix, Arizona, memories that they had from growing up. And yeah, again, it corroborates kind of what I shared last time of it, to go and right by the state penitentiary in Salem. So it's pretty cool to read this from people who lived here in the past and that experienced this line. I'm just looking here at some other, someone comments here, Muddy Railroad. HH writes, one of my former employers, Western Beverage, and he mentions years 89 to 92, had a spur off of this branch, I think. It was never used when I worked there, but I heard some interesting tales of times it was used. It seems the spur had a grade to it and caused trouble for a crew kicking a boxcar of beer into place. And yeah, I think there is a Western Beverage. May still be there. I don't recall. That could be one of the things we talked about last time where I noticed a spur. The topic, someone else is writing, the topic reminds me of a conversation I had with a friend out east some 40 plus years ago. Her father had worked for the Southern Pacific as a civil engineer and was partly responsible for building some branch lines and spurs. She said that he lived to see some of them abandoned and torn up. I wish that I had gotten more information from her or her father, but he had already died by the time I met her. In any case, it is a reminder of just how transient some of the railroad infrastructure can be, even back in the days when regulation made it more difficult to abandon lines. Another person writes, I definitely love all the Salem posts. I lived there for over 50 years and I was chasing trains in the 1960s on. An interesting thing about the Geer branch is that up until the late 1930s, it was dual gauge. From the Y next to Del Monte down to the yard at Pringle, that is Salem, Oregon, it was all dual gauge. The single line that ran closest to the yard office that seemed to stand alone, and that small yard that was next to the street, was the narrow gauge transfer line from what I could tell. It would be interesting to see if anyone has any more information or photos. I have a couple of photos I found on the web, and of course I can't show the photos here. But I think I had heard, the original rails that came through the entire Willamette Valley and the east side line in particular, I think were all narrow gauge. So it's interesting to hear this gentleman say that it was dual gauge. That sounds pretty cool. I would have loved to see that. Basically, dual gauge, as I understand it, to be 3 rails instead of just 2, so the narrow gauge could also operate on it. Okay, there's another comment here. The track shown in the 5th photo is not dual gauge, but looks to be a scale track that most yards used to have. The straight rail would have been the normally used rail, as constant banging of cuts of cars across the scale would not have been good. The rail that comes off it would have been the scale track lines, that way only when the cars were being weighed one at a time. Great bunch, he says. My older brother lived in Salem for a few years, and I made summer visits each year as well as a late 60s Thanksgiving visit. It was a great railroad town with lots of street running. And I don't know if he's referring to the street cars. I mean, I've been in Salem basically my whole life. That was probably before my era, because I don't ever remember street cars in downtown running. But I know they were there. I mean, I've seen the plat maps for the tracks, so I know that once was part of it. Maybe just a couple more posts. Thanks for the images. I followed and took a few pictures of the branch from Geer to Salem in 1992. I don't remember seeing any freight cars anywhere. So in 1992, the route probably would have still been open. That's right when I was in high school, and I think it was still a fully functioning railroad through there at the time. At least most of the way. They may have cut off part of it into town, but I just don't recall. Alright, 3 more posts here. On this fella, this one's interesting testimony too, because it's an engineer. Only worked it twice as the engineer. There was a long stretch where it wasn't good over 5 miles an hour. And he's exactly right about that. It wasn't a prize of a railroad through the air. And I remember the trains that did go through there, they just crawled. And that's what I remember seeing, and that's what this gentleman's saying too. For all I know, I was watching this guy, when he went through there. You just crawled along, watching the ends of the next rail bounce up in the air, and when you got close to the joint, it would come back down on the ties. This was all the way across to the other branch. I was told a boxcar derailed one day, and it was almost 2 weeks before a crew was called to dig it out. Between Salem and I-5, you went through the prison. I had heard about the dual gauge, but I thought I was being sandbagged. This is the first pic I've seen. Oh, can't forget the beanery. Had bumper stickers saying, "I've eaten at Pig Turd Alley." There was a road where we tied the train down to eat as long as it cleared the crossing. It was on a nasty little short grade, and you had to tie everything down before you left the train. Another person comments, "I also didn't realize the Southern Pacific used Alco switchers in Oregon. I thought that was Baldwin territory with a dash of some SW1200s and the 70-ton GEs until the SW1500s arrived. I never saw any movement on the Geer branch. Boy, the Southern Pacific sure crisscrossed the Willamette Valley back in the day." Finally, one last comment here. I have photos and was watching when they tried to kick a car into a different ear spur on the west side of Lancaster. If I find those old photos, I will post them. He must not have found them. I didn't see them. Also, digging back into my memories as a kid, I picked beans in Al Detweiler's bean yard between Central Howell and Silverton. The Woodburn Springfield branch ran along the south edge of that yard, and once in a great while an SD9 would roll past, usually light engine. So I'm sure for those that don't live in this area, everything I just read probably bores you to tears, but to me, I just find it fascinating. It's just a little bit of history, and like I say, I don't know who keeps history records like this. This one is on the internet, and we used to say that anytime something goes on the internet, it's there forever. Well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But some of this, testimony would be interesting to try to preserve. Whether it's this spot here or some other place. I don't know, and maybe not everybody's interested in the history of things. I just find it fascinating to see how things changed over time and to hear from the people who actually, were there. I mean, that's kind of how history books are written anyhow. Plus, there was the last post on here was the most personal one to me of all. He mentions bean picking in Al Detweiler's bean yard. Well, I pretty much know exactly where that is. I'm related to Al Detweiler. He passed away a long time ago. Talking to my mother, maybe my father. It used to be kind of a rite of passage here in the valley where kids would go pick beans for a local farmer. There's a lot of pole beans grown back in the day before they kind of changed over to the bush beans that are now picked with machines. So back in the day, there was a lot of kids, that would go summer work or what have you, would go into the bean fields to earn some money. And so I know kind of where this gentleman is speaking, and he's right. This route, this Geer branch, once it hits the Y, that hits the north-south route, then it heads up to, I'm not sure, I can't judge a distance here, a couple miles maybe. Although, well, that's probably what it is on the road. Given that it's straighter with the railroad here, it's probably a little shorter than that. But it goes up to a little town called Pratum. And that's kind of the other one I wanted to talk about here. And this one is much more difficult. I can't even visualize it on the map, let alone try to describe it here. But they're way back in the day, and I may have alluded to this last time, off of this branch, Southern Pacific branch, there was an attempt to make a rail spur to the east. And as I understand it, the history is really skinny on this because Pratum is a small town. I don't know that it ever had a paper, so the records are totally sketchy, and there's virtually nothing on the ground. I can't look at Google Earth and be able to tell where were the railroad ties placed. There's just nothing there. I'm not sure a single tie for this one was ever placed. What we do know is there was some rail grading done. So now, Pratum's just a tiny little town, has a church, has a few homes kind of in the area, has a grass seed cooperative. There's lots of grass seed grown in the area, so farmers take their grass seed here to sell it, to purchase chemicals and fertilizer. I mean, it's a farm town, classic farm town, if you will, although I'm not even sure that it's incorporated. It's small enough, it doesn't even have a post office. I think it has a fire station. We're talking one of those places that if you blink, you'll miss it. So, but it has the railroad running right through it. I think years ago, Pratum may have purchased or sold some things via rail. They don't do that anymore, of course. It's been a long, long, long time since I've seen any trains moving along the tracks through there. But anyway, they at one time, and I think it was latter 1800s, early 1900s, they wanted to consider putting in a rail to the east of Pratum that would head up into, they call it the Waldo Hills. That's kind of what the area is named, where there was a lot of wheat that was farmed. And maybe this will resonate with some of you here in terms of describing the area. And I realize I'm doing a voiceover here and I'm farming in the background. Maybe I should, by all rights, be doing this on the Lone Oak Farms map. Well, the Lone Oak Farm isn't that far from Pratum. It's maybe 4 miles, 5, something like that, further to the south and east, out in the country. So, you know, one way you can get to Lone Oak Farms is through Pratum. So Pratum, I mean, the rails run through it. You head to the east, and one of the first things you encounter is the Pudding River. And the Pudding River squiggles around. There's another creek that in a few miles heads into the Pudding River, and it's called Beaver Creek. And Beaver Creek is for any that have played on the Lone Oak Farm map, Beaver Creek is the little waterway that comes off of the pond that's in the map and heads to the north. And it isn't Beaver Creek per se, but almost, how far from the dam that's in that pond? Maybe 500, 750 feet, you know, from the pond. Then it enters Beaver Creek. Beaver Creek eventually flows into the Pudding River. And I say all this because most of the time, you know, when you see rails navigating mountains or obstacles, you know, they always want to try to keep the grade as minimal as possible. So what they tend to do is to follow rivers, you know, that cut through the earth to try to make as gentle a grade as possible. So I'm looking at a map here. I have Google Maps up. I can't even tell where the line exactly went. I think we only know for sure one particular area where it came through. And the reason we know it's there is really very simple, is we can still see where they graded the road, you know, where it came up, where the rails were going to be placed. And even that, you could say, well, how do you know they weren't grading a road? Well, we know that there's an area of where the grading happened where there is no road. So there's no point for the grading to be there other than that we have heard about this railroad that was going to be in. Now, other parts of the rail grade are in fact being used on, it is not a regular road, you know, it's a farm access type road, but it's one of those things where you can just tell the grade is, you know, if it's a road to drive a pickup on or something like that, it may go up and down. It doesn't have to be sloped gently at all. But when you're on a road, it very gradually moves the grade. That kind of clues you in that you're on a railroad type grade. So there's a particular area where we know some of that was put in there. The hard part is we don't know the exact location of the line. We don't really have any records. You can't tell where it was. There's no artifacts that I'm aware of that have been dug up. You know, like I say, we don't even know if ties and rail were ever literally laid. All we know is a railroad, such as it is no longer there. And we think at some point it petered out. They probably lost funding or decided it wasn't worth it. But back in the day, there was a lot of wheat grown kind of in the Waldo Hills, like I say, which is where Lone Oak Farms is situated. And so they wanted to take a spur up into the hills so they could haul the wheat to market. And fortunately, however it is, it was never built, never used. And the other thing it may have been coming up for too, and I mentioned this in my Lone Oak Farm series, is there's coal up in the hills. You know, years ago, when I was working on Lone Oak, they had a new well that was dug, and I remember a period of time while they were drilling, they went through at least one layer of coal. I think they said it was about 6 feet deep, a 6-foot layer of coal that they were digging up. So there was mining activity on the Lone Oak Farm many moons, I think, before my grandfather purchased it way back in the day. So it could be that the trains were kind of headed up into the hills, you know, to be able to haul coal out of there as well. But kind of like the wheat, you know, while there is coal there, you know, just because there's a resource available doesn't mean that it's always economical to remove. And I've looked up old mining records also for what our local town or state holds, and it's really fascinating to pull up paperwork from just many years ago when that was a working mine. And my father can testify to seeing the hole in the ground where they were working it. I think my grandfather bulldozed it shut. I mean, that's kind of a story in its own right. From where it used to be. So suffice it to say, they attempted to get it, but it just didn't prove economical to haul coal out of Lone Oak Farms. Otherwise, the history of the area would be way different than it is now. There'd probably be an open pit mine, or who knows what would be there. You know, what's interesting is here not that long ago, my uncle's up there. I don't know how they found it, but they came across an access hatch into the mine. Of course, I think it was filled with water. Not sure what all they did with it, but they kind of have it a protected thing over it now, so nobody just falls into it. But maybe the rail that they proposed to go up there was also to haul coal. Anyway, I'll get off my railroad kick here. I just, like I say, I kind of was in a historical mood, and I would just ask again, I shouldn't assume that people listening to this are necessarily interested in history, but you probably have something that you're fascinated with and you find yourself sinking time into, and I'd be curious to know what that is if you want to leave a comment. Otherwise, thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed watching good old Gelvin Valley going in the background as we try to take care of our sheep and prepare the soil to get ready to be replanted. So thanks for coming along. We'll see you in the next one. Goodbye for now.